What if one of the Brown family's quietest daughters has actually been saying more through her silence than through words? For years, Sister Wives fans have watched Kody Brown's relationships with his children become increasingly complicated. Some children have openly confronted him. Others have spoken about disappointment, distance, or the difficulty of maintaining a relationship with a father they feel has changed. But Aspyn Brown has generally been much more private, and that privacy is exactly why her name is suddenly raising questions. The title of this video asks whether Aspen quietly cut off Kody Brown, and what could be behind her silence. But before we go any further, there is an important distinction we need to make. There is no solid public evidence that Aspen has officially announced that she has cut Kody off completely. In fact, the public record tells us something more complicated. In 2025, Kody himself described having a serious conversation with Aspen after their relationship had become strained. According to his account, Aspen asked him what was wrong and why he didn't like her. Kody said the two had a long discussion and that their relationship actually improved afterward. So this isn't a simple story of a daughter publicly declaring war on her father. It's more emotional than that. It's a story about distance. It's a story about a daughter asking her father a devastating question. And it's a story about what happens when a child grows up, becomes an adult, and starts looking at her relationship with a parent through completely different eyes. Because Aspen wasn't just any child in the Brown family. She was Kody Brown's oldest daughter and one of Kody's oldest children. She grew up watching her parents navigate an unusual family structure. She grew up surrounded by siblings. She watched her mother and Kody's relationship evolve over the years. And then she watched that relationship eventually fall apart. Kody announced the end of her marriage to Kody in 2021, and that breakup didn't just change two adults. It changed the entire family. Suddenly, the children who had grown up seeing their parents together were forced to navigate a completely different reality. There were new homes, new relationships, new family dynamics, new boundaries, and for children who were already adults, there was something else. They had to decide what kind of relationship they wanted with their father after the family structure they knew had collapsed. For Aspen, that appears to have been particularly complicated. Kody revealed that after Kody left, he became distant from several of the children he shared with her. But then something happened that may have been one of the most revealing moments in the entire story. Aspen confronted him. And according to Kody's account, she didn't come at him with a list of accusations. Instead, she asked a painfully simple question. What did I do? Why don't you like me? Think about that for a second, because when a daughter asks her father why he doesn't like her, that isn't just an argument. That's hurt. That's confusion. That's a child, or in this case, an adult daughter, trying to understand why the relationship has changed. And Kody said he told her that he loved her and always had. He also said the two talked about wanting a relationship that wasn't filtered through his feelings about Kody or Kody's feelings about him. That statement alone tells us how complicated the Brown family relationships had become. Because Aspen wasn't simply Kody's daughter anymore. She was also Kody's daughter. And after the divorce, Kody appeared to feel that his relationships with some of his children were being affected by their relationships with their mothers. Kody has repeatedly described feeling alienated from some of his adult children after the breakdown of his marriages. Kody has pushed back against that interpretation, saying she didn't speak badly about Kody to the children and wished he would reach out to them more. So already, we have two very different perspectives. Kody says he felt unwelcome. Kody says she wanted him to have better relationships with the children. And somewhere in the middle of those competing perspectives are the children themselves. That's the part that sometimes gets forgotten. The children are not simply extensions of their parents. They're adults. They have their own memories, their own feelings, their own experiences, and their own relationships with both parents. Aspen is a perfect example. She wasn't obligated to see her father's relationship with Kody the same way Kody saw it. And she wasn't obligated to see the divorce the way Kody saw it either. She had her own experience. And when she asked Kody why he didn't like her, she was revealing that the distance had affected her personally. That's why the idea of silence becomes so interesting. Because sometimes silence isn't proof of hatred. Sometimes silence is what happens when someone doesn't know what to say. Sometimes it's a boundary, Sometimes it's exhaustion, sometimes it's simply privacy, and sometimes it's the result of years of complicated emotions. That's why we should be careful about saying Aspen has completely cut off Cody when there hasn't been a public announcement confirming that. In fact, there is evidence that complicates that theory. A 2025 report noted that Cody still followed Aspen and her husband Mitch Thompson on Instagram. That doesn't prove they're close. It doesn't prove they're speaking regularly. Social media follows don't tell us what happens privately. But it does show why we shouldn't turn rumors into facts. The more accurate question may not be, did Aspen officially cut off Cody? The more interesting question is, what happened to their relationship after the family fell apart? And why did Aspen feel strongly enough to confront her father and ask whether he even liked her? Because that question didn't come out of nowhere. Something had changed, and viewers had already watched the Brown children struggle with the consequences of their parents' changing relationships. Aspen was raised in a family where relationships were always complicated. Cody wasn't simply married to one person. He was the father of children across multiple households. The children had different mothers. The family lived in different homes, and as the years went by, the adults' relationships became increasingly difficult. For a child, that can create a strange emotional environment. You may love everyone, but you can also sense when the adults aren't getting along. You may want your parents to be happy, but you may also feel caught between them. And when your parents eventually separate, you suddenly have to figure out whether being close to one means being disloyal to the other. That doesn't mean Christine or Cody intentionally put Aspen in that position. It means divorce can create complicated emotional territory even when everyone is trying to do their best. And reality television adds another layer. Because the Brown family's problems weren't happening behind closed doors. They were being discussed on television, they were being discussed online, they were being analyzed by viewers, and years later, people are still talking about them. Imagine being one of the children in that environment. You grow up, you become an adult, you get married. You create your own life, but people still ask you about your parents. They still ask about Cody. They still ask about Christine. They still ask about the family. At some point, silence can become a form of control. Not necessarily control over another person, control over your own story. Maybe you don't want to explain every family disagreement. Maybe you don't want to comment on every episode. Maybe you don't want your private conversations turned into headlines. Maybe you simply want to live your life without constantly answering questions about your parents. And Aspen has historically been much quieter than some of her siblings. That makes her silence stand out even more. Other Brown children have spoken openly about their relationships with Cody. Some have criticized him. Some have described feeling abandoned. Some have talked about wanting reconciliation. Others have simply moved on. Aspen's approach appears to be more private, and perhaps that privacy is intentional. After all, look at what happened when she finally did speak directly to Cody. She didn't make the conversation public herself. Cody was the one who later described it on Sister Wives. And that's an important detail, because we are hearing his version of the conversation. We aren't hearing a complete transcript from Aspen. We don't know everything she said. We don't know every emotion she experienced, and we shouldn't pretend we do. But even Cody's description tells us something. He said Aspen confronted him. He said she asked why he didn't like her, and he said their conversation improved their relationship. That means there was enough pain or confusion for Aspen to feel she needed answers. And that may be the real story. Not a dramatic cutoff, not a secret feud, but a daughter who reached a point where she needed to understand what was happening between her and her father. And perhaps that is what makes Aspen different from some of the other Brown children. She may not need a public confrontation to establish a boundary. She may simply step back. She may choose privacy. She may choose her marriage. She may choose her own household. She may choose peace over constant family drama. And if that's what she's doing, it wouldn't necessarily mean she hates Cody. It could mean she has decided that her adult life doesn't need to revolve around the conflict between her parents. That's a very different thing. And it brings us to another important part of Aspen's story, her own marriage. Aspen married Mitch Thompson in 2018. Her wedding was documented on Sister Wives, and viewers watched her move into adulthood in front of the cameras. E also reported that she announced her pregnancy in 2025. That transition matters because becoming an adult changes your relationship with your parents. You're no longer simply someone's daughter. You become someone's wife, then perhaps someone's mother. And suddenly your priorities shift. You start thinking about the family you are creating. You start thinking about the environment you want around your children. You start thinking about what relationships are healthy, and you may begin setting boundaries that would have been impossible when you were younger. Aspen has now had years to build her own identity outside the Brown household. And that may be why the relationship with Cody looks so different today. The little girl who once needed her father's approval has become an adult woman who can decide how much access anyone has to her life. That's a powerful change. And it doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes the biggest family changes happen quietly. No announcement, no screaming match, no social media post, just fewer phone calls, fewer visits, less conversation, more distance. And eventually, people notice. That's why fans are wondering about Aspen now, because the Brown family has been through so much change that silence itself can feel like a statement. But here's where we have to separate what is known from what is speculation. We know Cody described a strained relationship with Aspen. We know Cody described a strained relationship with Aspen. We know Cody described a strained relationship with Aspen. We know Cody described a strained relationship with Aspen. We know Cody described a strained relationship with Aspen. We know Cody described a strained relationship with Aspen. We know Cody described a strained relationship with Aspen. We know Cody has described feeling alienated from several of his adult children, and we know Christine disputed his explanation for why those relationships became strained. What we don't know is exactly what Aspen's private relationship with Cody looks like today. That's the part that remains private. And perhaps that's exactly how Aspen wants it, because not every family disagreement needs to become content. Not every relationship needs a public verdict. And not every child of a reality TV family wants to spend their adulthood explaining their parents. Maybe Aspen's silence isn't a mystery that needs to be solved. Maybe it's a boundary that needs to be respected. But there is still one question that remains. Why did Aspen feel the need to ask her father, "Why don't you like me?" That question takes us much deeper into the Brown family's history. Because to understand that moment, we have to go back to the years when Aspen was growing up. We have to look at Cody's relationship with Christine. We have to look at how the children experienced the family's plural structure. We have to look at the move from Utah to Las Vegas, then to Flagstaff. And we have to look at what happened when Christine finally decided she was done. Because when a family structure changes after decades, the adults aren't the only ones affected. The children carry pieces of that history with them. And Aspen may have carried more than viewers realized. For years, she was often portrayed as one of the more responsible and mature Brown children. She helped with siblings. She took family responsibilities seriously. She grew up quickly, and then she entered adulthood while the Brown family was entering one of its most turbulent periods. That timing matters, because imagine building your own marriage while watching your parents' relationship collapse. Imagine trying to establish your own identity while the family you grew up in is changing around you. Imagine watching your mother begin a completely new chapter, while your father struggles with the consequences. And then imagine being asked to choose sides. Even if nobody directly asks you to choose, you can still feel the pressure. That is why Aspen's confrontation with Cody is so emotionally significant. She wasn't asking him to fix the entire family. She was asking about their relationship. She wanted to know where she stood with her father, and perhaps that was the most honest thing she could have done. Instead of silently assuming he didn't care, she asked. Instead of continuing to wonder, she confronted the problem. And according to Cody, the conversation helped. But whether that improvement lasted is something the public simply doesn't know. And that uncertainty is important, because sometimes a relationship improves after one emotional conversation. Sometimes it improves temporarily. Sometimes the conversation opens a door that remains difficult to walk through. And sometimes, two people love each other but still struggle to maintain a relationship. Love doesn't automatically erase history, and family doesn't automatically mean closeness. Those are two different things. That may be one of the hardest lessons the Brown family has had to learn. You can love someone and still be hurt by them. You can forgive someone and still keep boundaries. You can want reconciliation and still need time. And you can choose silence without choosing hatred. So maybe the real story behind Aspen's silence isn't that she cut off Cody. Maybe the real story is that she has reached adulthood and realized she has the right to define that relationship for herself. And if that means more distance, she can choose distance. If it means reconciliation, she can choose reconciliation. If it means occasional contact, she can choose that too. The public doesn't get to decide. And perhaps that's the most important thing to remember as we continue looking at this story. Aspyn Brown grew up on television, but she doesn't owe television the rest of her life. She can step away. She can become private. She can create a family that isn't centered around the sister wives storyline, and she can decide how much of her relationship with Cody belongs to the public. That's where this story gets even more interesting, because the question isn't simply whether Aspen has gone silent. The question is what that silence means. Is it hurt? Is it healing? Is it a boundary? Is it simply privacy? Or is it the result of a relationship that changed so dramatically that neither father nor daughter knows exactly what comes next? And the answer may be buried in the history of the Brown family itself. Because before Aspen became the adult woman fans see today, she was a daughter growing up inside one of reality television's most complicated families. But to understand why Aspen's relationship with Cody became so complicated, we have to go back before the silence, before the distance, and before the Brown family began falling apart. Because Aspen was not just another child in the Brown family. She was the oldest daughter of Christine and Cody, and she grew up carrying a very visible place within the family. From the beginning of Sister Wives, viewers saw Aspen as someone who often appeared mature beyond her years. She was surrounded by younger siblings, multiple mothers, multiple households, and a father whose attention was divided among a very large family. And then there was the television show. The Brown children weren't simply growing up in a complicated family. They were growing up in a complicated family while cameras documented it. That distinction matters, because when you're a child, you don't get to choose how your family structure looks. You don't get to choose which conversations become public. You don't get to decide whether millions of strangers will have opinions about your parents. And you don't get to decide whether an argument that happened years ago will still be discussed online when you're an adult. Aspen eventually had to grow up inside that reality. And as she got older, she began creating a life that was increasingly separate from the family drama. One of the biggest turning points was her relationship with Mitch Thompson. Aspen and Mitch eventually married in 2018, and their wedding became part of Sister Wives. TLC's episode description specifically follows Aspen and Mitch's wedding day, showing how her transition into adulthood became part of the show's storyline. That wedding represented something bigger than just a romantic milestone. It was Aspen stepping into adulthood. She wasn't simply one of Christine's daughters anymore. She was building her own marriage, her own home, her own future. And that matters, because adulthood changes the balance between parents and children. When you're young, your parents make most of the decisions. When you're an adult, you start making your own. And sometimes those decisions don't line up with what your parents expected. That's especially true in a family as complicated as the Browns. Aspen had to figure out what kind of relationship she wanted with her parents as an adult. And that became even more important when Christine and Cody's relationship began to collapse. Christine eventually announced in November 2021 that her relationship with Cody was over after more than 2 decades together. For Christine, that was the end of a marriage. For her children, it was the end of the family structure they had known. And this is where things get emotional. Because children can understand that their parents are unhappy. They can understand that a marriage isn't working. But they can still love both parents. They can still want both parents in their lives. And they can still hope that the divorce won't destroy their relationship with either one. But the Brown family didn't simply experience a quiet separation. The breakdown of the plural family became one of the biggest storylines of Sister Wives. Christine left. Janelle's relationship with Cody later fell apart. Mary's relationship with Cody also ended, and suddenly, the children were no longer living inside the same family system they had grown up with. Cody was now separated from 3 of the women who had been central figures in his children's lives. And that meant the children had to navigate relationships with a father who was himself navigating enormous anger, grief, resentment, and disappointment. Cody has openly discussed how painful that period was for him. He has also claimed that he felt unwelcome around some of his adult children after the family breakdown. But here's where the story becomes complicated. Kody's interpretation is not necessarily the same as his children's, and that's something viewers have repeatedly seen. One person can believe they were rejected, another person can believe they were abandoned. One person can think they reached out, another can feel like they weren't contacted, and both people can walk away from the same relationship with completely different memories. That's exactly why Aspen's confrontation with Kody is so important. According to Kody's account, he visited Christine's daughters in Utah in early 2024, and Aspen confronted him about their relationship. Kody said Aspen literally asked why he didn't like her. That is an incredibly painful question for a daughter to ask her father. And Kody's response, according to his account, was that he loved her and always had. But Aspen apparently wasn't satisfied with simply hearing that he loved her. She wanted to understand why she had been feeling distance. Why did she feel unwanted? Why had the relationship changed? Why did her father seem different toward her? Those questions tell us something important. Whatever the exact circumstances were, Aspen perceived a change. And that perception mattered enough for her to address it directly. Kody said he explained that after the breakup with Christine, he had been in a place of pain and felt unwelcome reaching out to the family. But according to Kody, Aspen told him that she had never intentionally made him feel unwelcome. That difference is huge, because Kody was describing his emotional experience. Aspen was apparently describing hers. Kody felt pushed away. Aspen apparently didn't believe she had pushed him away. And somewhere between those two perspectives, their relationship had become strained. That is the kind of family conflict that can continue for years, because neither person necessarily believes they caused the problem. Kody can say, "I felt unwelcome." Aspen can say, "I never made you feel unwelcome," and both can genuinely believe what they're saying. That's why blaming one person doesn't necessarily solve anything. The bigger problem may have been the breakdown of communication itself, and according to Kody, the conversation actually helped. He described the discussion as improving their relationship immensely. That detail is extremely important for anyone discussing the claim that Aspen completely cut him off, because if Kody's account is accurate, their relationship wasn't simply a clean cutoff. There was a period of distance. There was a confrontation. There was an emotional conversation. And at least according to Kody, things improved afterward. So the phrase "quietly cut off" should be treated carefully. It may describe how some fans interpret her distance, but it is not something Aspen has publicly confirmed as a formal decision. And honestly, that makes the story more interesting. Because the truth may not be as dramatic as a complete cutoff. It may be more complicated. It may be a relationship that has gone through periods of closeness and distance. It may be a daughter who wants her father in her life but doesn't want to be dragged into the conflict surrounding the family. It may be a daughter who is willing to communicate when necessary, but doesn't want her private relationship turned into a public storyline. Or it may simply be that Aspen has chosen to live her adult life privately. And that possibility is important. Because Aspen has never been one of the Brown children most eager to publicly dissect every family conflict. Other siblings have been much more outspoken. Some have discussed Kody directly. Some have talked about their disappointment. Some have described estrangement. Some have been open about wanting reconciliation. Aspen has generally maintained a lower profile. And that could be a deliberate choice. After all, silence doesn't automatically mean anger. Silence can mean privacy. Silence can mean boundaries. Silence can mean someone has decided that explaining themselves isn't worth the emotional cost. And sometimes silence can mean someone simply wants to move forward. That's especially understandable when you've grown up on reality television. Imagine having your childhood documented. Then imagine becoming an adult and realizing that people still want explanations about your parents. Every family disagreement becomes a headline. Every social media interaction gets analyzed. Every photograph becomes evidence of who is close to whom. Every absence becomes suspicious. At some point, you might decide, "I'm just not going to explain my private life anymore." And that may be part of what we're seeing with Aspen. But there is another major factor, Christine, because Aspen isn't only Kody's daughter. She is Christine's daughter, and Christine's relationship with Kody has been one of the most emotionally complicated relationships on Sister Wives. Christine has spoken openly about feeling unhappy and unfulfilled during her marriage. She eventually chose to leave. Cody, meanwhile, has repeatedly expressed resentment about the way the marriage ended. And when parents have radically different feelings about a divorce, adult children can still feel caught in the middle, even if nobody explicitly tells them to choose sides. Think about the pressure. Your mother leaves your father. Your father says he feels betrayed. Your mother says she needed freedom. Your siblings have different opinions. The television audience has different opinions. And suddenly everyone expects you to have an answer. But what if you don't want to choose? What if you love your mother? What if you also love your father? What if you believe your mother had legitimate reasons for leaving? What if you also believe your father deserves a relationship with you? That's an incredibly complicated position, and it may help explain why Aspen's approach appears to be more private. She doesn't necessarily have to publicly defend either parent. She can maintain her own relationship with each person, or she can decide that certain relationships require distance. That's her decision. And the same principle applies to Cody. He is allowed to have his perspective. But so are his children. That's something that became increasingly clear as the Brown children entered adulthood. They stopped being little kids sitting around the family table. They became adults with their own marriages, their own homes, their own careers, their own beliefs, and their own children. That changes everything. Because once you become a parent yourself, you may start viewing your own childhood differently. You begin asking questions you never asked before. What kind of father do I want to be? What kind of family do I want to create? What kind of environment do I want around my children? What relationship should my children have with grandparents? What boundaries are necessary? And what family patterns should stop with me? Those questions are especially relevant for Aspen because she has entered motherhood herself. In 2025, she publicly confirmed that she was expecting her first child with Mitch. That was another major transition from being one of the Brown children to creating a family of her own, and that may change how she views everything, because becoming a parent can make you look at your own parents in an entirely different way. Sometimes it creates empathy, sometimes it creates anger, sometimes it creates both. You might understand why your parents made certain decisions, but you might also realize that you would never make those same decisions. You might appreciate what they gave you, and still decide that you want something different for your children. That's not necessarily rejection, it's adulthood. And perhaps that is what makes Aspen's situation so fascinating. She doesn't have to erase Cody from her life to create a life separate from him. She doesn't have to publicly attack him. She doesn't have to announce a cutoff. She can simply build her own family and decide what role everyone plays in it. That's something people often misunderstand about estrangement. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it's public, but sometimes it's quiet. A relationship simply becomes less central. Calls become less frequent. Visits become less common. People stop explaining themselves, and eventually, the distance becomes normal. That may or may not be what's happening with Aspen. We simply don't have enough public information to say. But the fact that fans are asking questions shows how closely people have followed her story. And perhaps that is the downside of growing up on television. Your privacy becomes interesting to people. Your silence becomes a storyline. Your absence becomes suspicious. And even when you're doing nothing, people want to know why. That's something Aspen has had to deal with for years. But there's another part of the story that deserves attention. Cody has acknowledged that his relationships with several of his adult children became strained. In 2025, he became emotional while discussing his failures as a father during his appearance on Special Forces, World's Toughest Test. People reported that he was forced to confront his struggling relationships with his children and the regrets surrounding those relationships. That matters because it shows that even Cody has publicly recognized that something went wrong. The disagreement is often about why it went wrong. Who was responsible? Who should reach out? Who owes whom an apology? Who is being unfair? Those are the questions that keep families stuck. And perhaps the most difficult thing about the Brown family is that everyone seems to have a different answer. Cody believes he was pushed away. Some children have described feeling neglected or disconnected. Christine has said she wanted Cody to maintain relationships with the children. And now there are adult children who are deciding for themselves what kind of relationship they want. That is the new reality. Cody can no longer simply define the family. The children are adults now. They can say yes, they can say no, they can say maybe, they can say not right now. And Aspen's situation may be one of the clearest examples of that transition. She grew up in Cody's family. Now she has a family of her own. And that means she gets to decide what family means to her. Maybe that includes Cody. Maybe it includes him from a distance. Maybe it changes over time. Maybe the relationship becomes stronger again. Maybe it doesn't. The public simply doesn't know. And that uncertainty is exactly why the headline needs context. The shocking part isn't necessarily that Aspen cut off Cody. The shocking part may be that their relationship became strained enough for her to ask her father whether he even liked her. That is the emotional moment. That is the moment worth examining. Because behind every public family feud are private questions. Do you love me? Do you want me here? Did I do something wrong? Why did you stop calling? Why don't you come around? Why does it feel different? Those questions are much more painful than any headline. And when an adult daughter asks her father one of those questions, it suggests that the relationship matters to her. If she truly felt nothing, she might never have asked. She might simply have disappeared. Instead, according to Cody's account, Aspen confronted him. She wanted an answer. And that tells us there was still something worth fighting for. Perhaps that is why the conversation improved things. Sometimes families don't need another argument. They need someone to finally say, let's talk about what happened. And for Aspen, that may have been the turning point. But what happened after that? Did the relationship stay improved? Did the distance return? Did motherhood change the situation? Has Aspen chosen to keep things private? Those are questions the public still can't answer with certainty. And that's where the story should remain respectful. Because we can analyze what has been publicly shown. We can discuss what Cody has said. We can discuss what Christine has said. We can look at the history of the family. But we shouldn't invent private conversations that nobody has confirmed. That's especially important when talking about someone's relationship with a parent. The Brown family has already lived enough of its private life in public. Perhaps Aspen's silence deserves to be taken at face value. Maybe she's simply choosing a quieter life. Maybe she's protecting her marriage. Maybe she's protecting her child. Maybe she's protecting herself. Or maybe the relationship with Cody is actually better than the public realizes. That's entirely possible too. Remember, social media isn't a complete picture of someone's family life. A missing photograph doesn't prove estrangement. A follow doesn't prove closeness. A public appearance doesn't prove everything is fine. And silence doesn't prove hatred. The only thing we can say with confidence is that the relationship has experienced strain, and Cody himself has publicly discussed that strain. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. If Aspen really wanted nothing to do with Cody, why would she confront him? Why ask him why he didn't like her? Why have that difficult conversation? Perhaps because she wanted answers. Perhaps because she wanted reassurance. Perhaps because she wanted to know whether her father still wanted a relationship with her. And perhaps, somewhere beneath all the Brown family drama, that is what Aspen has wanted all along. Not perfection, not a public apology, not a television storyline, just a relationship that feels real. And that possibility changes how we interpret her silence. Maybe silence isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's simply what happens when someone stops explaining themselves to the world. And if that's the case, then the question isn't whether Aspen has cut off Cody. The real question is whether Cody has learned how to meet his adult daughter where she is now, not where she was when she was a child. Because Aspen isn't that little girl anymore. She's a wife. She's a mother. She's an adult. And she has the right to decide what kind of relationship she wants with her father. And this brings us to the biggest question surrounding Aspyn Brown and Kody Brown. If their relationship has been damaged, can it actually be repaired? Because the most interesting part of this story may not be the distance itself. It may be what that distance reveals about the Brown family, now that the children are adults. For years, Cody was at the center of everything. He was the father, he was the husband, he was the person trying to hold multiple households together. He was the person explaining the family's choices to viewers. But the children who grew up inside that world are no longer children. They have their own homes, their own marriages, their own careers, their own opinions, and increasingly, their own definitions of what family should look like. Aspen is part of that generation. She doesn't need to live inside the family structure her parents created. She doesn't need to accept every decision her father makes. And she doesn't need to publicly explain every decision she makes herself. That's an important distinction, because the internet often expects a dramatic ending. People want a post saying, "I cut him off." They want a confrontation. They want somebody to expose somebody else. They want a final answer. But real family relationships rarely work that way. Sometimes there isn't a final moment. Sometimes relationships simply change. A daughter gets married. She moves away. She becomes a mother. Her priorities change. Her father changes. The family structure changes. And gradually, the relationship looks different. That's what makes Aspen's story so difficult to summarize with one sentence. Did she officially cut off Cody? There is no public confirmation that she has made such a formal declaration. In fact, Cody's own account of their conversation suggests that the relationship had improved after Aspen confronted him. So a more accurate description is that their relationship has experienced strain and distance, while the exact state of their private relationship today remains unknown. And that may actually be more powerful than the dramatic version. Because if Aspen has chosen privacy, that's her decision. She doesn't owe viewers a statement. She doesn't owe the Sister Wives audience a reconciliation. She doesn't owe anyone an explanation for how often she speaks to her father. And she doesn't have to turn her private relationship into another television storyline. That is one of the strange consequences of growing up on reality television. When the cameras stop, the audience doesn't always stop watching. People continue following. They continue speculating. They continue looking for clues. A photograph becomes evidence. A missing photograph becomes evidence. A social media follow becomes evidence. A birthday message becomes evidence. Silence becomes evidence. But none of those things can tell us what happens behind closed doors. And that is especially important when we're talking about Aspen. She has generally maintained a quieter public presence than some members of the Brown family. That may be exactly what she wants. Maybe she has decided that her marriage and children are more important than maintaining a public explanation of her relationship with Cody. Maybe she doesn't want every family conversation analyzed. Maybe she has simply learned that privacy gives her something reality television never could. Control. Control over what people know. Control over what people don't know. Control over what parts of her life belong to her. And that may be the real reason her silence feels so loud. Because viewers know the Brown family story. We know how public it has been. So when someone chooses not to participate in that conversation, people notice. But silence doesn't always mean something terrible happened. Sometimes silence means someone is finally choosing themselves. And there is another reason Aspen's story matters. Her relationship with Cody cannot be separated from the larger breakdown of his relationships with his adult children. Over the years, Cody has spoken publicly about feeling disconnected from some of his children. He has described feeling rejected. He has expressed frustration. He has also acknowledged regrets about his relationships as a father. In his appearance on Special Forces, Cody became emotional while discussing his children and the pain surrounding those relationships. Reports about the appearance described him confronting his own failures as a father. That is important because it shows that Cody himself recognizes that the relationships are not where he wants them to be. But recognition is only the beginning. A relationship doesn't heal simply because someone admits it is damaged. It requires communication. It requires consistency. It requires trust. And sometimes it requires accepting that the other person may not be ready. That last part is especially important because adult children don't necessarily want the same relationship with their parents that they had as teenagers. Their expectations change. Their boundaries change. Their priorities change. And once they have children of their own, those boundaries can become even stronger. Aspen is now building her own family, and that means she has to think about the environment around her children. She has to decide who gets access to them. She has to decide what kind of family relationships she wants them to experience. And she has to decide what lessons from her own childhood she wants to pass forward. That doesn't automatically mean Cody is excluded. It doesn't automatically mean he is included. It means the decision belongs to Aspen and her husband. And that's something the Brown family has had to learn over and over again. The children are adults now. They don't need permission to create their own lives. They don't need permission to move. They don't need permission to marry. They don't need permission to disagree. And they don't need permission to establish boundaries. That is why Aspen's story feels different from the earlier years of Sister Wives. Back then, the children were watching the adults make decisions. Now the adults have to watch the children make decisions. And sometimes those decisions are difficult for parents to accept. That's true in ordinary families. Imagine how complicated it becomes in a family whose entire history has been documented publicly. Every disagreement can become a storyline. Every boundary can become a headline. Every family gathering can become a source of speculation. That is why Aspen's quiet approach may actually be the healthiest approach for her. She doesn't need to fight publicly. She doesn't need to expose private conversations. She doesn't need to prove anything. She can simply live. And perhaps that is exactly what she is doing. There is also something important about her relationship with Christine. Christine has remained a major part of Aspen's life. And after Christine left Cody, she built a new chapter of her own. She eventually married David Woolley. She moved forward. She created a life beyond the marriage that had defined so much of her adult life. Her children watched that transformation, and Aspen watched it too. That may have shown her something important. Parents can start over, children can grow up, families can change, and leaving one chapter doesn't mean your life is over. Sometimes it means another chapter can finally begin. That's something Aspen has experienced herself. She built a marriage with Mitch. She has entered motherhood, and she has continued creating a life outside the original Brown family structure. Her identity isn't dependent on Cody anymore. And perhaps that is what makes her relationship with him easier to understand. When you are a child, your relationship with your parent can feel like your entire world. When you're an adult, it becomes one relationship among many. Your spouse matters, your children matter, your friends matter, your career matters, your mental and emotional well-being matter. And sometimes maintaining peace means accepting that a relationship cannot occupy the same space it once did. That doesn't necessarily mean the relationship is dead. It means it has changed. And maybe that's what happened between Aspen and Cody. Maybe the old father-daughter relationship is gone. But that doesn't necessarily mean there can never be a new one. The conversation Cody described between them is actually evidence of that possibility. Aspen asked difficult questions. Cody answered. And according to him, the relationship improved. That's important. Because if there was absolutely no hope of reconciliation, that conversation might never have happened. The fact that they spoke suggests there was still something there. But whether that improvement continued is unknown. And we should leave that uncertainty where it belongs. With them, not with us. Not with online speculation, not with fan theories, because sometimes the healthiest thing we can do as viewers is recognize the limits of what we know. We can analyze the public story, we can discuss the patterns, we can talk about what the family has said publicly, but we shouldn't pretend we know what happens privately. That is especially true when a person is not publicly discussing the situation herself. Aspen hasn't given viewers a detailed public explanation of her current relationship with Cody, so we should not create one for her. And that may actually make the story more compelling, because we're left with questions. Not fake answers. Questions. What does Aspen want from her relationship with Cody? Does she want reconciliation? Does she want occasional contact? Does she want a completely private relationship? Has becoming a mother changed her perspective? Has Cody's own attempt to repair relationships changed anything? And perhaps the biggest question, can a father rebuild trust with an adult child after years of emotional distance? That's not a Sister Wives question. That's a human question. Parents make mistakes. Children get hurt. Families change. People grow. And sometimes relationships survive those changes. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the people involved need years before they can even understand what happened. Maybe Aspen is still figuring that out. And that's okay. One thing is clear, though. Aspen has grown into someone very different from the young girl viewers first met. She is no longer simply one of Kody Brown's daughters. She is Aspyn Brown. She has her own marriage, her own family, her own experiences, her own voice, and her own right to decide how much of her life becomes public. That's why the headline, Aspyn Brown quietly cut off Kody Brown, needs to be handled carefully. It is a strong hook. It creates curiosity. But the real story is more nuanced. There is evidence of strain. There is evidence of a difficult father-daughter conversation. There is evidence that Cody himself recognized the relationship had become distant. There is also evidence from his account that the two reached a better place after talking. What we don't have is a definitive public statement from Aspen saying she has permanently cut Cody out of her life. That distinction matters, because a dramatic headline might get clicks, but a credible channel earns viewers' trust by explaining where the facts end and speculation begins. And in a story involving someone's family, that matters even more. The strongest part of this story isn't claiming that Aspen has secretly declared war on her father. The strongest part is that at one point, she apparently felt enough distance from him to ask, "Why don't you like me?" That sentence says more than 100 social media posts could, because it shows vulnerability, it shows confusion, and perhaps it shows that underneath all the Brown family drama, there was still a daughter who wanted to know whether her father loved her. Cody's answer, according to his own account, was yes. He said he loved her. He said he always had. And the two talked about rebuilding their relationship. That's where the story becomes bittersweet. Because sometimes people love each other and still hurt each other. Sometimes parents believe they are doing the best they can, while their children experience the consequences differently. Sometimes both sides feel misunderstood. And sometimes the only way forward is to finally have the conversation nobody wanted to have. Aspen apparently had that conversation. And perhaps that's why the silence afterward should not automatically be interpreted as rejection. Maybe she simply decided she didn't want to discuss the relationship publicly. Maybe she wants the relationship to exist outside the cameras. Maybe she wants to give it room to develop privately. Or maybe the relationship remains complicated. We don't know. But what we do know is that Aspen has created a life of her own. And that may be the most important part of this entire story. She isn't waiting for Cody to define her future. She isn't waiting for the Brown family to become what it once was. She's moving forward. She's building her marriage. She's becoming a mother. She's creating her own family traditions. And she's deciding what kind of relationships belong in that future. That's adulthood. And perhaps Cody's biggest challenge is understanding that his children no longer need the father they needed when they were little. They need a father who can meet them as adults, a father who can listen, a father who can acknowledge hurt without immediately defending himself, a father who can accept boundaries, a father who can show up consistently, and most importantly, a father who understands that rebuilding trust takes time. If Cody can do that, perhaps there is a future for some of these relationships. If he can't, the distance may continue. But that decision ultimately belongs to both sides. And Aspen has every right to decide what feels healthy for her. So is Aspyn Brown secretly at war with Cody? There is no solid public evidence to say that. Has their relationship experienced serious strain? Yes. Cody himself has publicly discussed that. Did Aspen once confront her father about feeling disliked? According to Cody's account, yes. Did that conversation reportedly improve their relationship? Cody said it did. Has Aspen publicly confirmed that she has permanently cut him off? No. And that last point is extremely important. Because the truth may be far less dramatic than the internet wants it to be. Maybe there is no secret feud. Maybe there is simply a daughter who has learned to protect her peace. Maybe there is a father who is still trying to figure out how to repair relationships with his adult children. Maybe there is a family learning that love alone isn't enough. You also need communication. You need accountability. You need consistency. And sometimes, you need to give people space. That may be the real lesson from Aspen's story. Silence isn't always punishment. Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes distance isn't hatred. Sometimes distance is healing. And sometimes a relationship isn't truly over just because it doesn't look the way it used to. The Brown family has changed dramatically since Sister Wives first premiered. The children grew up. The marriages changed. The family separated into different households. The parents entered new chapters. And now the children are creating families of their own. Aspen is one of those adults. She doesn't have to recreate her parents' family. She gets to create her own. And perhaps that's what viewers should focus on. Not whether she has secretly cut off Cody, but whether she has found a way to live her life without being trapped inside the conflicts of her childhood. Because that is a much bigger story. It's about a daughter becoming an adult. It's about a family changing. It's about boundaries. It's about forgiveness. It's about whether broken relationships can be repaired. And it's about accepting that sometimes the people you love need to love you from a different distance. For Aspen and Cody, the story may not have a final chapter yet. There could be reconciliation. There could be more distance. There could be occasional contact. There could be another difficult conversation. Or they could simply continue living separate lives while carrying complicated feelings about each other. Only they know what happens behind closed doors. And perhaps that's exactly how it should remain. Because after growing up in front of millions of viewers, Aspen deserves the opportunity to decide what parts of her adult life belong to her. Maybe her silence isn't a shocking secret. Maybe it's a statement. A statement that says, "My life is mine now." And if that is what Aspen is choosing, then perhaps the most surprising thing isn't that she became distant from Cody. Perhaps the most surprising thing is how quietly she learned to stand on her own. And that may ultimately be the real story behind Aspyn Brown. Not a daughter trying to destroy her relationship with her father, but an adult woman deciding what kind of relationship, what kind of family, and what kind of future she is willing to build. And for someone who grew up with cameras following her every move, choosing silence may be one of the most powerful choices she has ever made.